Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast. This is our Time's Up series. This is the second episode of this series. This one is all about the high cost of staying in Canada illegally. Now, the last podcast episode, we talked about the generalities of what's going on in Canada, the reality that many people are running out of status. They're wondering what to do when their work permit expires. And Alicia, we are in a whole new world, are we not?
Yeah, it is a very competitive landscape. I can't emphasize how much it is important to be strategic, to understand what's going on with immigration, and things are really, really tightening up. There are not as many options for permanent residency, and the options for temporary residence are becoming fewer and fewer as well.
Yeah. So what I want to do, at least in this episode, everyone, as you're tuning in, there's so much misinformation out there about, what do we do when the work permit expires? And we're going to talk a lot about that in the various episodes that are to come. We're going to talk, practically speaking, about the options that are available from a practical standpoint. But today, this is all about kind of disabusing all of the misinformation, all of the just the bad direction, the bad instruction, the bad information that is being spread around about choosing to stay illegally in Canada. And so, in the first, like I said, in the first episode, we gave a quick little summary about, the current challenges. And we know that many, many people are in this type of a situation. But in this episode, this is all about trying to help you to understand why it's not a good idea for you to ever consider this. So, Alicia, maybe you can just touch on at the start the legal landscape of this. So, from a legal standpoint, and then we'll get into some of the practical realities.
Yeah, and so from a legal standpoint, anybody who's in Canada is going to have some sort of status document. If you're not a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, then you have to have something else to allow you to be inside of Canada. And that something else could be an electronic travel authorization. It could be a visitor visa. So those are the key temporary status documents, the way to get into Canada, ETA or TRV. And then after that, you might also have a study permit or a work permit or some other maintained or authorized status to work if you're kind of in between an extension on those documents. So what happens when your status expires? And there's two things you need to keep track of. One is the work permit or the study permit. What's the expiry date on that? The other is what's the expiry on your ETA or your TRV? And so the key thing to look at here is Regulation 183 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. And this says, here's when your authorized stay ends, among other things. If you leave Canada and you're not authorized to re-enter, right? If you leave, your status might be gone. When your study or your work permit expires, your status is gone. When the extension of your visa ends, right? So if your ETA or your TRV is expired, then your authorized stay ends. Sometimes people don't know. So in some cases, especially Americans, if they've come to Canada and all they have is a little stamp on their passport, or sometimes there is zero stamp on the passport these days, then the rule for that is 6 months from the date that you entered Canada. So if there's nothing stamped on the passport, the rule is after 6 months from the date that you entered, your authorized stay ends. If you had a TRP, which is another specialized document we can talk about a little bit more, but if you have a TRP, whenever that expiry date on the TRP ends, then you have no authorized stay. And then the other interesting one that people might be missing and is probably going to come up more frequently now is the date of your biometrics. And so biometrics have now been required for a number of years. And if your biometrics are 10 years old and you haven't renewed your biometrics, that is also going to be a trigger point for your end of authorized stay. Last important one to talk about right now is when your passport or your travel document expires. So that is also going to end your authorized stay.
You know, lots of people they just gloss right over the realities of the legal side of things. When we're talking about individuals that make this choice to to, you know, to let their status expire, let their visitor status, their work status, or study permit status expire, there is still a way to restore status, right, Alicia? And so after, you've got a 90-day window to fix it, essentially.
Yeah, and we'll do another kind of talk on restoration itself, but it is important to note, and so I've talked about this also in the two Times Up blog series articles that we have on our website, but there are certain circumstances that cannot be fixed by restoration, right? Certain types of overstays or actions that you've taken that make you inadmissible to Canada cannot be fixed by restoration, but in a lot of cases, a simple overstay can often be fixed by restoration, just like you say, Mark, if you make sure to do that restoration application within that initial 90-day period from when your status ended. And that's why we're talking about Regulation 183, because it's important to know what's the day that your authorized period ends. Yeah, so here are the articles. There's two of them. The first one is the overview with the little clock there. And then the second one is how long can I stay in Canada after my work permit expires? And that's going to be a written version of many of the things we're talking about today.
Mhm. Okay, let's shift gears. So to this point, we've covered a little bit about the legal landscape. So the next thing that I want to touch on is the immediate consequences of being illegal. So what happens the moment that work permit, and even, technically before, even if you're within the restoration period, what happens when an individual allows their work permit to lapse and they do not leave Canada before that date?
hmm And this is also in the section. So an inadmissibility happens basically. And so now under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, not the regulations. So now we're into section 41 of the Act. And so anybody is inadmissible under section 41 for non-compliance. So if you fail to comply with the Act, and the Act says anybody who's in Canada who's not a Canadian citizen or PR needs to have valid authorized status, and your status ends under Regulation 183. So you're inadmissible for failing to comply with the Act. And says in the case of a foreign national, through any act or omission which contravenes directly or indirectly a provision of the Act. So it's important for people to know that inadmissibility happens after that work permit expires, after the TRV status expires, or any of those other things that we just talked about.
Yeah. And the reality is, sure, you're inadmissible, but there may be employers out there that are willing to hire people and pay them under the table, which then leads to a potential for massive exploitation. And I'll share a little experience even fairly recently. There was a client that I had. Well, it's been probably 3 years now. Fortunately, the client is a permanent resident, but they were working for an employer. They did not have a work permit. The employer was holding out this little carrot that they'd get an LMIA and support their permanent resident status in Canada. But unfortunately, it never came. And then 1 year led to 2 years, led to 3 years. And in that time, they continued to extend their stay as a visitor. So in their case, they didn't even allow themselves to completely fall out of status, but they were still in this world where they were on visitor status and did not have work authorization. Well, minimum wage in Alberta was about $15 an hour. She was getting paid $11 an hour, right? Cash. And she didn't have a work permit. So she was completely at the whim of this employer. And it was a really, really bad situation. Fortunately, she came to me and there was some options that we had available to try to fix her status. We reported it to the authorities. I wish the authorities had a harsher hand. That's kind of my view. But regardless, this person just had no power and they were completely subject to the whims of this employer. So you have to be careful. When aside from, the fact that maybe you're going to get lower wages, you have no protection from employment standards. In some cases, she worked more hours than she was paid, let alone not getting paid overtime. And all of the protections that are in place when an individual has valid work authorization, they're just not there. So be aware of that. Now,
Yeah,
mm, Go ahead.
And and you bring up a really good point, Mark, because sometimes people think, oh, well, I fell out of status. Maybe I'll just work under the table for a little bit, and then maybe at some point I can get, an employer to support me on an LMIA or some other international mobility program, LMIA exempt work permit. Maybe I can somehow regularize my status later. And the problem with this is that there's actually regulations that say if you've engaged in unauthorized work or unauthorized study and you try to apply for a new study permit or a new work permit, there's actually a 6-month bar. And so under Regulation 200 sub 3, if somebody, and this applies to students as well, if somebody has engaged in unauthorized study or unauthorized work, officers at IRCC are not allowed to issue a new study or a new work permit until 6 months have elapsed since that last day of unauthorized work or study.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
And
it's
this
a
is,
it's a long section. Yes.
yeah. All right, let's continue on. So we've covered to this point the immediate consequences of remaining in Canada illegally. Then there's the long-term impact, Alicia. And this is something that we could get into so many other aspects of short term. Your driver's license expires, your social insurance number expires, you lose healthcare coverage. So all of those kick in the short term. And not to mention, if once you become illegal, Canada tracks exits and entries. They can see from based on your passport if you haven't left the country. And for example, if you're applying for a US visa later on, Canada has a lot of information sharing agreements with the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, other countries. And so the consequences of remaining in Canada without authorization can actually affect your ability to go to other countries as well.
Mhm.
And so these are going to stay with you, not just in the short term but long term. So when we're thinking about the reality in terms of long term impacts, you're going to be living in poverty, Alicia. There's no promotions, right? You're going to employers that are willing to hire you and to pay you under the table. You're going to hardly have a subsistence job. Like, you probably won't even be able to maintain enough money, to support yourself in Canada, let alone sending some home to your family. And there's no opportunity for career growth. There's no upward mobility and getting promotions and things like that. And and if there is, man, I let alone just knowing that you're out of status and at any point in time someone could report you to the authorities, like from a psychological standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, just a wellness standpoint. I can't imagine the stress that would be on someone's mind, wondering one day if someone's going to come knocking to start removal proceedings. So your employment is unstable. You're often faced with low wages, and that constant fear of deportation is a reality.
Mhm.
Now, Alicia, we've heard, this is one of the rumors, and myths, I guess, that I want to dispel. But, there's this perception. Well, remember before when Minister Fraser, right here, when he came out and granted an 18-month post-grad work permit under special measures to individuals who had fallen out of status. And in fairness, Alicia, that those provisions were retroactive to some extent. They saved people that were outside of the 90-day period for restoration. And
Mhm.
so what would you say to individuals who said, well, they're not going to let us, go illegal too long. There's going to be an amnesty. There's going to be an ability to allow us to transition to PR. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that is that we're in a whole different world now. And so those temporary public policies were enacted when we had a labor market that required workers. And we were just coming out of COVID. There were labor market needs. people couldn't leave. There were kind of exceptional circumstances, and that's where those came from. That is no longer the case. That is no longer the world right now. The labor market is super tight. The housing market is extremely difficult. Strains on healthcare, there's strains on other aspects of infrastructure and social services. And now the tide is turning, and immigration is saying not only are we going to have fewer numbers of temporary residents overall, but we have a goal to bring down that level of temporary residents over the next year. And so they're actually actively reducing the number of visitors and workers and students. There are caps now on the study permits. Master students and PhDs are subject to the caps. We have provincial attestation letters. We have this world where there are now going to be restrictions on postgrad work permits, right? So there's a language requirement. Going forward, there's going to be linking your postgrad work permit to what sort of program is going to be in demand and tied to a labor market objective. And so this is a totally different world, and there will not be a safety net thrown out to save you because immigration federally is reducing all the temporary resident numbers.
And one thing we cannot ignore is the impact of politics within these decisions. We have an election coming up. We don't know what the outcome will be, but one thing we do know is that the public perception of immigration is starting to take a little bit of a hit. And maybe that's an understatement. And so when elected officials feel like there's an issue that is becoming almost a wedge issue in the election, well, they're going to take whatever steps they can to try to gain favor with that portion of the electorate that they think may vote for them if they make certain decisions. And one of those decisions, like Alicia talked about, is the reduction in temporary residence in Canada at extreme cost, right? And you think of the steps that are being taken. Even recently, they've instituted even further rules to restrict the availability of labor market impact assessments, even for employers who want to retain their workers longer if they're on a post-grad work permit. We know that if the Conservatives get elected, they tend to be a little bit more strict with their immigration policies. They're not nearly as open as the Liberals have been. And, there's a far greater adherence to putting Canadians first. Not that the Liberals didn't, but for sure their policies, especially the 18-month post-grad work permits, it's unlikely if the Conservatives were in power that they would have done that, but we just don't know. But going forward, we've heard rumblings of them even looking to tie immigration numbers to housing builds in Canada. And so when you have these realities, I'll just reiterate, like Alicia, an amnesty is not coming. And so to make that your basis or your justification for allowing yourself to fall out of status is something we would never, ever advise you to do. So we have now spent a little bit of time, scaring you as much as we can. And we don't mean to scare, but just to educate you. The reality is people need to also understand that going home may be the smarter option. And, when we look at, some of the discussions that have occurred over this last little bit, we'll get our things lined up here. There's been a lot of discussion about, well, if I go home, I may never be able to come back. Well, the reality is, if you go home, this may be the only way that you can come back. Mm-hmm. By remaining in valid status in Canada. And when that status expires, you abide by the temporary conditions and show Canada that you left when your permit expired. And mm-hmm. when you are looking to come back to Canada, Alicia, showing that you've complied in the past is going to be a huge, huge positive when it comes to applying for another temporary application to come back.
Yeah. And so maybe, Mark, I'll say this. I'll say, let's go through two scenarios. Let's say scenario A, you know that your work permit's expiring. You decide, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I'm just going to try to stick my head in the sand and hope that this goes away. You keep working past the expiry of your work permit. Eventually, you realize that you don't have healthcare, you don't have any ability to protect your status, and you're falling into economic difficulty. And so eventually you decide, okay, well, I better go home, but if immigration issues removal proceedings, and so this is something that Mark has talked about as well, that you can be removed once you're inadmissible. And so if immigration starts to issue removal proceedings against you, this is now on your record. The overstay's on your record. You are removed from Canada, and you will have to get what's called an authorization to return, which is special permission from the minister to ever be allowed back in Canada. That's scenario A. That is not a good scenario. Scenario B, just like Mark said, is you realize your work permit's expiring. Before the end date on your work permit, you make everything you need to do to tie up affairs in Canada. You move back to your home country, you start working in your home country, and you have left Canada before that end date on your work permit. You're now in a position where you can gain foreign work experience, which might help your CRS points, and you have voluntarily left in compliance with your authorized stay. So there is no mark against you on your immigration record. And if you qualify in the future for another work permit or a study permit or a permanent residence application, there's no inadmissibility that you need to then overcome. You're in a much stronger legal position.
And I can confirm as well that the reality is if you do stay, that black mark on your record, if you stay for a few months and then decide, oh, maybe I'm going to go home because I ran out of money or whatever it might be, well, that extra 2 months that you've chosen to stay beyond the validity of your temporary document, it can mean all the difference in getting that next one approved. So it truly results, if you comply and go home, in coming and reapproaching Canada from a position of it's a more powerful position, because when you're saying, hey, I want to now apply for a visitor visa to come to Canada, or I want to come back and I've got another job offer for another company, they're going to go back and look and they'll see, oh, okay, that work permit expired. This person went back. And so it's pretty hard for them to say, well, we don't believe that you'll go home following the, completion of your temporary stay. It's hard for them to make that argument when you've already demonstrated an ability to do that in the past. But the converse to that is remaining longer, and then they can use that and say, no, even though you've got this rock star job, even if it's an intercompany transfer or something like that, that's under the International Mobility Program or an international agreement that Canada maybe enters into with your country in the future, they will look at your history, and even in those circumstances, they can say, no, we're not going to approve this because you've shown that you will stay beyond the authorized period of your stay in the past, and we think there's a good chance you'll do it again. And so another reason, and Alicia, I'll highlight one other thing that you said, which in terms of express entry, people that do not have any foreign work experience, they've just come to Canada, they've studied, they've worked, you need to just do your own math with the comprehensive ranking system and just assess what would happen if you went back home and gained one more year of foreign work experience. In many instances, it actually results in a fairly substantial points boost. It depends on other factors for sure, but just do the assessment and see for yourself. And so you take this awesome experience that you've gained in Canada, Canadian education, you go home, you reset, and it's entirely possible that other options will present themselves in the future. And even if not in Canada, maybe in another country. But compliance is always best. Now, Alicia, I just want to hit on, see if we can get just a couple more last minute. Actually, we'll do this one here. The employers to avoid and the hidden cost of staying. We addressed this a little bit briefly, but please, 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 you guys, there is massive risk of working for employers unlawfully without, work status. Like we said, I'm going to reiterate, they won't follow the employment standards rules. You'll have very little protection, if any. And the reality is, for those employers, built into the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and the regulations, there are provisions that can even, result in jail time and fines for employers who hire undocumented workers. Now, the fines, absolutely, we've seen that. Bans from the foreign worker program, we've seen that. I haven't yet seen jail time for an employer who is, employed without authorization, but, anything is possible. But in terms of just crushing future opportunities, when people are in these desperate kind of dire straits, Alicia, sometimes they'll turn to marriages of convenience. Do you want to just hit on that very, very quickly? Because this is kind of one of the other, hidden costs.
Mhm. And sometimes it happens that you've come to Canada, you've been studying and working here for a number of years, you meet a lovely Canadian and you start a relationship. It is really important that you're not rushing into a marriage, a legal marriage, or moving in together and hitting that 1 year common law cohabitation as spouses in order to gain an immigration privilege. And so immigration is going to look at your history. They're going to see, have you applied to other programs? Do you have like express entry applications sitting in the pool? Have you done a PR application in the past that's been refused? Or is your work permit now about to end and all of a sudden you're getting married? It is very important that that is a real relationship, that you guys are committed to each other as life partners, and that's the reason that you want to get married and or to move in together and become common law partners, not that you want to get immigration status. And so it is really important that you are aware of what the marriage of convenience, fraudulent marriages are all about. It is a violation. It is not a real marriage if it was entered into primarily for the purposes of immigration status. So there's a two-part test under section or regulation 4. And so it says, it's not a real marriage if even if other factors are genuine, if the reason that you entered into that marriage was to maintain or obtain an immigration privilege. So be really aware of that. Make sure that if you are going to get married to a Canadian, do it the way that you would normally enter into a marriage, have your family present, go through all the ceremonies that you would normally go through, plan it in advance, go home to your home country if required, make sure that you are submitting your application. And there's an article that we have on the blog about an in-Canada application versus an outside Canada application. If there's a risk that you might be refused for a bad faith marriage, make sure that you file a family class application outside of Canada and that you have a right of appeal to the Immigration Appeal Division.
Yes. And as we wrap up here, Alicia, with the last thing that we wanted to address, this is just the beginning, you guys. So please subscribe, because this Time's Up series, today we talked about the high cost of staying in Canada legally, but we're also going to be addressing the real options. And like I said, busting some of the myths that are associated with, applying for restoration of status, applying for things like temporary resident permits, or, filing for refugee status or things like that, and humanitarian and compassion applications. We're going to break down these in detail, the how-tos, but also when to know not to apply, when to know that I should just go home and not try to exhaust these options. And so we're going to try to help to set those things up for you, and just really clarify a lot of these things. I'm also going to talk about politics a little bit in terms of the various parties' platforms, because when you are looking at what elections are happening, and we've got one coming next year, those parties have different platforms and different policies related to immigration. And knowing where they stand, what they've said, can give you a better idea as to what the future might hold. Because, who would have thought even 2 years ago that our Liberal government would be making the decisions they are making right now with respect to the foreign worker program, the restrictions, the caps, all of the changes that they're making now. It's hard to anticipate. But the more information, the more knowledge you have, the better position you are to make good decisions for your future. So we're going to be doing more future episodes. We'll be releasing them here on our YouTube channel, as well as on the Canadian Immigration Podcast. So make sure that you subscribe to both of those. I want to just give a little bit of a shout out here. Let's see. To our Express Entry Accelerator, which is our new course that we created this year for the purposes of assisting people who are looking at express entry. And I'm just going to shift over here and just share this quickly. So you can go to the Canadian Immigration Institute, and we actually have a bunch of courses, but the Express Entry Accelerator, that express entry course is available now. And there's an awesome little masterclass associated with it that I run, and that goes every 2 weeks on Wednesday evenings. And we also have a brand new one on temporary resident visas. So if you or your family are looking to come and apply to Canada, this is a great little DIY course that Igor created to help you navigate the process. And we've got a Canadian citizenship application course coming up and a bunch of other ones. We're also going to be re-releasing our spousal sponsorship course and our study permit course, which went back to the drawing board to do some revisions because the government's constantly changing things. So we want to express thanks, to the Canadian Immigration Institute, that is the sponsor of this podcast. But I also want to bring up that within our firm, anytime you're in a situation where you don't know where to go, that's where legal advice can really help. And in our live Q&As that we do every Wednesday morning, which we're going to be doing about a minute from now after recording this episode, we are able to answer questions. So join us on anywhere you're following that live Q&A that is spread out through LinkedIn and Twitter even and YouTube, of course. So wherever you watch it, you can get general questions answered. But if you need specific legal advice, you can go to our firm website. There's a link in the description for this episode, and you can book a consult with Alicia, myself, or Igor, and it's super easy to book it. They come in 25 or 50-minute consults, and you can get the legal advice to help you make the good decisions when you're in tough spots. But as always, Alicia and I absolutely love when you reach out to us early so that we can have time to help you plan, because usually when you wait to the last minute and call us as the last option, often there's not much that we can do. All right. Thanks so much, Alicia, for joining today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast. And as always, like, subscribe, and share it with everyone you know. Thanks so much. Take care.